two Tornado F-3s out of RAF Coningsby are in pursuit of an intruder detected over the North Sea. It is speed and the ability to carry a wide range of weapons that's made the Tornado F-3 the Royal Air Force's frontline fighter. Fighter aircraft are designed to engage the enemy on the ground as well as in the air. Armor, shipping, infantry, artillery, trains and trucks are all fair game for these ruthless predators. But they must still be able to fight in the sky, attacking and dogfighting enemy aircraft. These are the hunters, from which no quarry is secure, no target immune. They fly only to fight. In 1915, aircraft were being used for reconnaissance. But they soon got so good at it that both sides started to look for ways of stopping them getting their information. The first aerial dogfights began as both sides fought to control the sky. Balloons, which were also being used for spying on the enemy, were easy targets. But a fast-moving target like another aircraft was virtually impossible to hit with handheld weapons. It was machine guns that were needed. The Germans' Fokker Eindecker was the first aircraft specifically built to shoot down other aircraft. It was lethal because it had a fixed machine gun that fired forwards in time with the propeller. This meant that it could be flown by a single pilot. All the pilot had to do was point his aircraft at the enemy and pull the trigger. Over the Western Front, British pilots of the Royal Flying Corps were simply shot out of the sky.
Something had to be done very, very quickly to counteract the German effectiveness. And a number of new aircraft were therefore developed, which soon, slowly but surely, gained air superiority for the Allies. And that therefore became an end in its own right, because you cannot do what you want to do unless you have air superiority, because the enemy will prevent you from doing it.
They needed a fighting scout, which was fast and heavily armed as well as maneuverable. And so, by 1917, a new generation of aircraft began to enter the squadrons of the Royal Flying Corps. Of these, the Sopwith Camel was probably the most successful. Its small, tough airframe, coupled with a powerful rotary engine, made it fast and highly maneuverable. Its two machine guns made it the perfect killing machine. However, the Camel could be just as deadly to inexperienced pilots as to the enemy. Red Cross, Victoria Cross, or Wooden Cross was how many pilots described what the Camel was like to fly.
The Camel was regarded by the pilots of the time as being extremely sensitive, almost neurotically sensitive. It had slightly lopsided flying characteristics, and pilots either loved it or loathed it.
The German response was the Fokker triplane, an aircraft copied from a British design. Its airframe was even smaller than the Camel's, and its shorter wings made it extremely maneuverable. Dogfights began in earnest, with pilots locked in deadly duels, twisting and turning, often coming as close as 50 yards of one another as they tried to gain the best position for an attack. Pilots of both sides soon came to realize success depended on height and speed. Gradually, combat maneuvers that were consistently effective began to evolve and form the basis of the first manuals of aerial fighting techniques, skills that are still taught to today's pilots of super fighters. After a pilot had shot down 5 aircraft, he was called an ace, and he was hailed as a hero by military commanders and the press alike, all desperate to bring a little glamour into a war which on the ground was literally bogged down in sodden trenches. Comic books and films later immortalized these aces, inspiring a whole new generation of pilots between the wars. In November 1918, the war ended. The newly formed Royal Air Force was now the largest air force in the world and had won its battle with the German air service. But lack of investment would force the RAF to continue flying First World War fighters like the Bristol F-2B for years to come. These were demoralizing times for fighter pilots.
I mean, we all got a pay cut. They didn't ask you if you wanted one, but you all had a pay cut. And I mean, petrol was 11 halfpenny a gallon, I think, if you've got the cheapest ROP, if you know what that means. It was a Russian oil product, it was called. But no, we just carried on normal lives without worrying outside. We worried that we had to beg to fly because they were so short of petrol, and things were short. And then when we did fly, certainly in the Siskins, you had an altitude control and a petrol control like you had in old motor cars. And we were all instructed you had to open up the air throttle until the engine coughed, and then to save petrol. I mean, it was extreme as that.
Indeed, fighter development was so thoroughly ignored that in 1935, when the Hawker Hind light bomber entered service, it was faster than any of the RAF's current fighters. In 1933, Germany began to rearm. Although banned from having an air force after the First World War, pilots were being secretly trained through private gliding clubs. She now began to build huge numbers of monoplane fighters and bombers. Seriously alarmed, the British government tried out various schemes until adopting the INSKIP report, which called for a more balanced air force of bombers and fighters. Fortunately, private enterprise had kept the quest for speed alive, so the technological expertise was there. The Schneider Trophy was a world-famous air race. In 1922, it was won by Sea Lion II, a seaplane manufactured by the British company Supermarine. Their chief designer, R.J. Mitchell, was subsequently converted to the idea of a single-wing design after losing the 1923 race to an American monoplane. In 1927, Supermarine was commissioned to build aircraft for the team entered by the RAF. The result was the S-5, which together with its successors, the S-6 and S-6B, won the trophy outright in 1931, having been successful in 3 consecutive races. These monoplane designs were further developed by Mitchell to produce the Spitfire. The prototype first flew on the 5th of March, 1936. Its performance was so outstanding that the RAF immediately ordered 310. Among its key features were an all-metal monocoque, retractable undercarriage, elliptical wing design, and, perhaps above all, the shattering new Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, which provided increased power without substantial extra weight. For pilots, it was love at first flight.
Really, whatever you say, one is fairly emotive when you're a teenager. And you sort of fall in love with things, apart from things with 2 legs. And you can fall in love with an airplane. That's what happened, I think, to any of us who got into Spitfires, and we realized it was going to be kind to us if we were kind to it, and we got to know it better and better. And when you sat in the cockpit of a Spitfire and you strapped yourself in, you actually wore it like a coat.
The Spitfire continued to be developed throughout the war. 44 different marks were produced to meet changing needs. Famously, the Spitfire's finest hour was the Battle of Britain. In the doomed battle for France, Britain had lost many experienced pilots in the face of an overwhelming German force. Now, invasion threatened Britain. But first, the Luftwaffe had to win the air battle. The defense of Britain was in the hands of a small band of young pilots. They were under the command of Air Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding, who knew something of the new technology required to modernize the RAF in the 1930s. Radar, a means of electronically plotting the position of aircraft, had recently been invented. Under Dowding, the RAF set up the very first integrated defense system, combining radar and wireless communications with the new fighters now equipping the squadrons. As soon as aircraft formations were detected by radar or the observer corps, the information was passed to a central control room at Fighter Command's headquarters. This information was then passed to the group operations room and then on to the nearest sector station. Squadrons would scramble, already knowing which direction the enemy were heading in and the strength of their force.
What fundamentally changed the way in which the Battle of Britain was operated was the fact that we had radar. But the Germans had radar too. Now, what made our radar different from theirs was that the radar was joined together, all the information was fused, it was centrally collated, so that the overall commander, as a general, could marshal his forces and therefore commit reserves when important, commit wings when important, and therefore ensure that he got the right number of aircraft in to match the size of raid that was appropriate. So we got huge efficiencies here out of our aircraft, which of course, had we used, as the Germans to some extent, had we used our radar as long-range binoculars, all radar gave you was a greater vision by your binoculars. We didn't do that. We created a form of virtual reality, to use the 20th century argot. We created a form of virtual reality that enabled us to put our aircraft in the most expeditious way.
Until 1940, this was the theory. Then the Germans attacked. The success of their assaults on France and Poland had largely been due to the Luftwaffe destroying the opposing air forces on the ground. Once again, the German targets were radar installations and airfields. Time and again, fighter squadrons scrambled as huge formations of bombers with fighter escorts of Messerschmitt 109s headed towards Britain. Spitfire pilots used their greater maneuverability to drag the Me-109s away, allowing the Hurricanes to hit the bombers. The tactics learnt by the first war fighter aces were used again. As a favorite saying had it,
"The chap who will control the battle will still be the chap who's got the height and the sun, same as the last war."
but Fighter Command was suffering. Although the British fighters had the advantage of being able to land, refuel and rearm more quickly than the Germans, constant attacks on airfields had pushed fighters further away from the combat area in the southeast. Reinforcements from 12 Group north of the Thames were taking too long to fly into the battle. Losses were being sustained at an unacceptable rate. Then Fighter Command got a much-needed respite. On the 25th of August 1940, Bomber Command launched an attack on Berlin. The Germans were shocked. Hitler was furious. In retaliation, he ordered that the Luftwaffe stop attacking airfields and instead launch an all-out blitz on London. RAF Fighter Command was able to regroup and continue to engage the incoming aircraft. Luftwaffe losses mounted. By the middle of September, in order to reduce their losses, the Luftwaffe switched to night attacks. In truth, the Luftwaffe had lost the Battle of Britain, and the invasion was postponed indefinitely.
We were fighting over our own soil. Therefore, our aircraft could fly, intercept and land and carry out very many more sorties than the Germans could in a unique period of time because they had to fly so much greater distances. So our force behaved as if it was a full-sized force, whereas the German Air Force, with the transit distances that it had to encounter, behaved as a much smaller air force, even though the overall force sizes were about the same.
Fighter Command could be justly proud of its victory and of Winston Churchill's immortal lines, "Never in the field of human conflict has so much been owed by so many to so few." In 1941, Fighter Command went on the offensive. Raids known as circuses, rodeos and rhubarbs were mounted with the aim of enticing the Luftwaffe into the air so that they could be pounced on by swarms of Spitfires.
There's considerable evidence to show that that meant that many German aircraft that would otherwise have been deployed to the Eastern Front were now retained for the defense of the bases in Germany, and therefore taking pressure off the Russians, which politically was extremely important at that time.
Initially, Mark V Spitfires were used, but the Germans now had improved versions of the Messerschmitt 109.
The Me-109 was about the same as a Hurricane, which was slightly less sensitive than a Spit. And the other thing too is tiny. The cockpit was tiny. I'm not a broad man, but I was sort of sitting sort of crunching up inside, no space at all.
They also had a totally new aircraft, which began to outfly the Spitfires, the Focke-Wulf 190. Something had to be done, and that something was the Mark IX Spitfire. Introduced in May 1942, supposedly as a stopgap, the Mark IX had a speed in excess of 400 miles per hour. With 2 Browning guns and 2 20mm cannon, it proved so successful that it stayed in service until the end of the war.
Quantum leap between the Mark V to the Mark IX was such that you just reveled in it. It was just superb. It climbed like a homesick angel, and it got a magnificent turn of speed, and yet it still had the maneuverability of the Mark V. I loved it.
At the same time, Fighter Command aircraft were dealing with night bombing raids over British cities. This was to be a frustrating time, as Fighter Command simply did not have the aircraft to mount an effective defense.
It was my 21st birthday on the night of the Coventry raid, and there was a chap, Sergeant Winter, who had been borrowing nights where I went on, took his duties because he'd got a girlfriend. And so he owed me about 6 nights' duty, and I said, right, you take mine this night. And he spun in from 27,000 feet, iced up, and I was given the job of taking back his so-called body to Coventry in a 1,500-weight truck the next day. I didn't swap duties anymore after that.
The only machines available for night interception were Bristol Blenheims, but their top speed of 260 miles per hour was only as fast as the German bombers they were supposed to intercept. More importantly, with no proper radar, finding intruders was more by luck than judgment. Night after night, in all weather, pilots scrambled in their Blenheims and Hurricanes in fruitless attempts to attack the enemy.
I did all the things of pressing the button, and then the silly lighter went into clouds. And I couldn't see him anymore. But I hit his slipstream all the time, and I was waiting for the cloud to pack up, and it didn't. So I pressed the button continuously and waved up and down and sort of gave him a spray, hoping rather like you do with a 12-bore, if you're hitting at a flock of birds, if you can't see one, well, one might come down.
The Bolton Paul Defiant, a fighter that had proved to be totally unsuitable as a day fighter, adapted well to night fighting. But it was the Bow fighter, with its integral radar system, that finally began to gain the upper hand at night. In the European theater, RAF fighter aircraft and pilots had reached new levels of lethal effectiveness at air-to-air combat. 2,000 miles to the south, in North Africa, the idea of using these powerful aircraft to attack the enemy on the ground was beginning to find favor. Earlier in the war, the Germans had used Stuka dive bombers to great effect. Their ability to drop a bomb on difficult targets such as moving tanks was impressive and immensely useful to the army. The Western Desert Air Force was equipped with Hurricanes, which had gradually been outclassed by the new German fighters. But equipped with rockets and 40mm anti-tank cannon, the Hurricane's extremely strong airframe made it the ideal ground attack aircraft. These Hurry bombers helped turn the tide of the war in North Africa. They caused havoc along the congested coast road, attacking the German Afrika Korps, destroying tanks and trucks with their powerful cannon. The essence of ground attack was communication. While pre-planned operations against fixed targets behind enemy lines would normally be successful, as long as the fighters enjoyed air superiority, close air support offered a different challenge. Often the enemy target was only a few hundred yards away from friendly forces. It was up to the ground troops to give the aircraft pinpoint locations for the target. In the event, this ground-to-air cooperation proved itself time and again. This new lethal weapon became known as the fighter bomber. Meanwhile, on Malta, the Western Desert Air Force was desperately engaged in a battle to keep the Mediterranean sea lanes open. Here, there were no sophisticated multi-role fighters available. Instead, the Gloucester Gladiator, the last biplane fighter in the RAF, equipped many squadrons, and although it was one of the fastest biplanes ever built, it was no match for the new generation of German monoplanes. Even so, 3 historic Gladiators christened Faith, Hope, and Charity defended the island against overwhelming odds until modern replacements arrived.
Enormous amount of power, its size and weight, very maneuverable indeed. And you could take a Gladiator, and if you wanted to gain height, you could amuse yourself by flying level, pulling up and doing a roll off the top, and then flying level and pulling up and do another roll off, and go on climbing with rolls off the top until you reached about 6,000 or 8,000 feet. I say that merely because not on the days of jest did you have that amount of surplus power.
By 1943, new aircraft were equipping the RAF. The Mosquito was developed privately by the de Havilland Company without any particular role in mind. But it answered perfectly the RAF's new need for a dedicated force of fighter bombers. The Mosquito was very versatile and devastatingly effective. The fighter bomber variants boasted armaments combining 20mm cannon, 303 machine guns, and 60-pound rockets, as well as still being able to carry up to 500 pounds of bombs. The Mosquito was powered by 2 Spitfire engines, Rolls-Royce Merlins, which gave it a top speed of 415 miles per hour, fast enough to outrun all enemy fighters of the day. And its all-wooden construction meant that it was almost invisible to radar. As the planning for the Allied invasion of France developed, No. 2 Tactical Air Force was formed. It was given the task of winning air superiority so that the troops could land on the beaches unmolested by German aircraft.
We were getting busier, yeah, sure. We were flying perhaps 2 or 3 so-called operations a day. They weren't very dangerous operations by this stage of the war, but we were operating over enemy territory 2 or 3 times. But we were also operating at night. And one of our jobs was to keep the German aircraft, night fighters particularly, on the ground. So both in Germany and France, we had continuous Mosquito patrols with bombs and machine guns who stuck around the aerodrome, and every time they put the lights on, you whipped in, dropped some bombs, machine gunned the control tower if you could see it, and disappeared into the black and did another 40 minutes, and then somebody else would take over, and you'd come back. This way we tried to keep the night fighters down.
Virtually everything of importance was attacked. Boats, trains, and vehicles, as well as the bridges, tunnels, and railways on which they tried to move. German aircraft were destroyed before they could even get airborne. June the 6th, 1944. was the longest day, D-Day, when Allied forces invaded Western Europe. 2,000 RAF fighters played a major role in the largest aerial umbrella ever assembled. But the expected Luftwaffe counterattacks never materialized. Not only had they been badly depleted by constant attacks in the previous months, but Hitler's insistence that the Allies' attack would come at the Pas-de-Calais meant that the bulk of the Luftwaffe's remaining aircraft was nowhere near the invasion area. Allied air superiority was so great that they flew over 14,000 sorties on D-Day, while the Luftwaffe managed less than 700. Finding very little trade in the air, the covering Spitfires came down to join the fighter bombers in attacking ground targets. Throughout the day, close cooperation between ground and air ensured that if anything German moved, it was immediately attacked. The beaches were virtually cut off from German reinforcements, and within days, Allied aircraft began to operate from captured airfields in Normandy.
After D-Day, more pilots killed themselves in Spitfires than the Germans did, because you could pull the wings off a Spitfire dead easy, though low down. It broke at Bay 19. And I saw a heat once of 365 Spitfires, crashed Spitfires. Nobody ever pulled off the wings of a Hurricane.
But the fighter bombers' greatest triumph was still to come. At the beginning of August, the Allies finally broke out of the Normandy bridgehead, threatening to trap thousands of German troops and tanks in a pocket near Falaise. As the German troops tried to escape the trap, both ends of the column were attacked by rocket-firing aircraft, Typhoons, Tempests, and American Thunderbolts, causing mayhem among the trapped Germans. Aircraft were allocated kill boxes, areas of ground which were constantly patrolled. Anything that moved was destroyed. One Panzer soldier described the day of the Tempest.
The never-ending detonations, soldiers waving to us, begging for help, burning vehicles from which piercing screams could be heard, men driven crazy, crying, shouting, swearing, laughing hysterically.
More than 10,000 Germans died in the hell of the Falaise pocket. Now the Allies swept through France and Belgium, with the fighters trying to keep pace, moving from airfield to airfield, sometimes staying for only a few days. Close air support was now being run with total efficiency. The cab rank system ensured that there were always plenty of rocket-firing aircraft on call to ground troops to deal with stubborn German defenses. Bombing raids by Allied aircraft continued throughout 1944, their effectiveness boosted by the arrival of the Mark III Mustang. Although made in America, this aircraft was originally commissioned by the RAF as an advanced fighter. When it was eventually given the same Merlin engines as the Spitfire, it became one of the fastest aircraft of the war. And most importantly, it had a flying range of up to 750 miles. Allied bombers could now be escorted by Mustangs all the way to their targets over Europe and home again. This protection meant far fewer losses of bombers to increasingly effective German defenses, and far more bombs being unleashed on German industry. But Germany could still hit back in other ways. On the 13th of June 1944, the first wave of a new terror hit London, the V-1 flying bombs. These primitive cruise missiles came in at 400 miles per hour, not an easy target for the air defenses. But at nearly 450 miles per hour, Tempest could outpace them and shoot them down. In the last months of the war, Fighter Command enjoyed total air supremacy. Its battle with the Luftwaffe won. A new era beckoned, the jet. Although by the end of the war in 1945, the Luftwaffe had been utterly defeated, for a year before, they had had possession of an aircraft capable of changing the course of the conflict, the Messerschmitt 262, Germany's first operational jet aircraft. This was a heavily armed aeroplane with a top speed well in excess of 500 miles per hour. Even then, jet propulsion was not a new concept. Frank, later Sir Frank Whittle, a pilot officer in the RAF, developed the world's first jet engine in 1930. But at that time, there was still tremendous potential for piston engines. It would be another 11 years before a British aircraft would fly using his concept. When jet development finally got underway in Britain, the Whittle engine was tested in a Gloucester-built airframe. And it was a Gloucester aircraft, the Meteor, that became the RAF's first jet fighter. 2 Rolls-Royce engines, each delivering 1,700 pounds of thrust, gave the Meteor a speed of around 400 miles per hour and a rate of climb of over 2,000 feet per minute. This performance would be greatly improved in later marks, but the Meteor's armament remained a traditional fighter configuration of 4 20mm cannon. Most Meteors operating in Europe were used against the V-1 flying bombs. But jet aircraft played very little part in the war itself and had no effect on its outcome. But the Me-262 and the Meteor set the standard for post-war military aircraft. The main role of Fighter Command had always been home defense. And by the time of the Coronation Review in 1953, Britain had the largest air force in Europe. Security was once again at the top of the agenda. The West's relations with the Soviet Union had deteriorated rapidly after the war, culminating in the closure of all land routes into Berlin and the explosion of the first Soviet nuclear bomb. Although the Soviet aircraft industry had lagged behind that of its former allies, now they were rapidly developing aircraft to compete with the best in the world. In 1947, the British government had sanctioned the export of a number of Rolls-Royce jet engines, which became the power plant for the latest and most impressive Soviet fighter, the MiG-15. This aircraft first saw active service in 1950 during the Korean War and was immediately successful. Meteors, flown by the Royal Australian Air Force, were no match for the MiGs. The revelation of the Meteor as virtually obsolete was a nasty shock for the RAF. More so because the post-war budget had also cut research funding, which meant that no natural replacement was anywhere near completion. To fill the gap, swept-wing Sabres, which had been so successful in Korea, were bought from America. This aircraft pushed the limits of fighter performance to a new level. The Sabre had a top speed of just below the speed of sound. The Sabres started to arrive in Germany in 1952, equipping frontline squadrons with an aircraft that could counter the Soviet MiGs. They would stay for 4 years until the new British jet fighters were ready. The first new aircraft to arrive were out of the stables that had given the RAF the Spitfire and the Hurricane. They were the Supermarine Swift and the Hawker Hunter. The Swift had been built as a fallback in the event that the Hunter didn't come up to expectations. But it was the Swift that proved to be unsatisfactory. The Hunter was a versatile combat aircraft and would become the backbone of Fighter Command. It was a pilot's dream. It represented a new step forward in performance, being capable of over 700 miles per hour and achieved a service ceiling of 51,000 feet. Easy to fly, responsive to pilots' needs, and capable of taking on many roles, the Hunter also proved to be a winner in the export market.
Ah, the Hunter, my love. The Hunter came in, and at that particular time I had been transferred from Benson, the ferry business, to Bruggen, where the Sabres were. And the Hunter came in, and the Hunter was absolutely a dream aeroplane to fly. It fitted you like a glove and would do anything. You almost had to think what you want done, and the Hunter would do it for you.
The Hunter could carry a wide range of weaponry, including the powerful 30mm Aden cannon, as well as bombs for ground attack. Hunters flew with squadrons in Germany and the UK, as well as taking an active role in the Suez Crisis, in Kuwait and in Borneo.
Hunters against MiGs. Well, this was our job, is that we would have been hunters against MiGs. I think the big problem there would have been that the MiG had an overall better performance. It climbed faster. It was certainly as good in its maneuverability. And I think our problem would have been that the MiG could get out of trouble and come back on a new attack, bearing in mind that the MiG had radar which could direct the missiles it had, and we did not. He could attack us from a position where we either couldn't see him or couldn't attack him back. The Hunter was the last RAF aeroplane where the thing was done between the chap's head and his eye and what he was told from the ground. He had nothing in his aeroplane which identified a target or anything else. We didn't have any missiles. We had guns. And guns you've got to get 400 yards behind the chap. And I think the MiG would be very difficult to get 400 yards behind.
The Black Arrow formation team, which flew Hunters, showed off the aircraft's extraordinary aerobatic abilities to the world. They created a sensation at the Farnborough Air Show of 1958 by flying a formation loop with no less than 22 aircraft. The Gloucester Javelin was the first delta-wing aircraft in the RAF and was designed as a two-seat all-weather interceptor. It came on the scene in 1956, but its performance was disappointingly inferior compared to the Hunter. However, its ability to carry extra radar did make it suitable for night fighting. By the mid-50s, the MiG-21, a supersonic aircraft, had entered service for the Soviets. Once again, the performance ante had been increased. Furthermore, the Soviets now had a powerful force of jet-powered nuclear bombers. And with weapons of mass destruction, it only needed just one bomber to get through. The British government was forced to reconsider all aspects of Britain's defense. The 1957 Defense White Paper proposed that a new generation of jet bombers, the V-Force, should carry Britain's nuclear deterrent. This force was to be supplemented by ground-launched ballistic missiles. The main task of the fighters was to defend the bomber bases from attack. In the immediate future, fighter aircraft would be equipped with air-to-air missiles. But in the long term, the plan was that surface-to-air missiles would replace fighters altogether. It looked like the dogfighter had had its day.
One day I was sent for by headquarters, and they said, "You're going to have to close your Hunter squadrons down." I said, "I beg your pardon." And they said, "Well, there's a white paper, and we've got to save one airfield here in Germany. So we want to make a hole, and we're going to put things into the hole backwards and forwards, and finally we'll close down Wunstorf or somewhere up the other end." And I said, "Look, I've got the best Hunter squadrons here. I know I have. There's another Hunter station. If you've got to take 4 squadrons out, take 2 of them and 2 of mine." "No, we're going to take all 4 of yours." I said, "Why?" And they paid me the biggest cack-handed compliment I've ever had. They said, "You are the only station, you command the only station which is efficient enough to close it down in the 3 weeks we've got."
Britain's NATO partners questioned the RAF's future ability to fulfill her role in the defense of Western Europe. And the aircraft manufacturers saw a shadow approaching that would curtail many of their projects in development. However, one such project was already so advanced and the level of increased performance so dramatic that its progress was not interrupted. The result was the English Electric Lightning, the only completely British supersonic interceptor ever to fly with the RAF. It embraced the American concept of an integrated weapons platform with all aspects of airframe, engines, armament, and radar, developed together to create the perfect fighter aircraft. With a maximum speed of Mach 2.3 or 1,500 miles per hour, a ceiling of 60,000 feet, and a rapid rate of climb, the Lightning outperformed everything else in the RAF.
I put reheat in and let the brakes go and set the stopwatch going. And I was passing 12,000 feet when air traffic called me and said, check at 15, friction ahead. I immediately replied, sorry, now passing 18. And we got to 30,000 feet in 1.5 minutes in reheat.
And it added a new dimension to air defense, air-to-air missiles. Although twin 30mm cannon for engaging enemy fighters were added to later marks, the Lightning was not really a dogfighter at all. However, it was such an advance on previous interceptors that it was able to carry out the fighter role for the next 10 years, therefore maintain continuity of Britain's air defense. It also brought back confidence to the pilots. As one said,
We know that we can catch any current bomber, and we know that we can outfight any fighter. This knowledge that we have the finest interceptor in the world gives the pilots tremendous confidence.
Advances in radar technology led to the opening of a new early warning system which could look far over the horizon. Combining this ground-based radar system with the Lightning meant that for the foreseeable future, manned aircraft still had an important role. From 1961, Fighter Command was assigned to Supreme Allied Commander Europe with a specific responsibility for aerial approaches to Great Britain and the defense of the strategic bomber force. The sight of pilots near their aircraft on instant readiness, waiting for the radar web to show up an enemy, echoed the days of 1940. Fighter Command was once again deeply involved in defense.
I always had 2 aircraft on the end of the runway at Lucas, ground crew and air crew sleeping there, and 2 at Wattisham. And any aircraft which, unidentified aircraft coming around the North Cape, I would scramble my fighters to intercept them. And the boys kept league tables at Lucas of how many interceptions they did. Every aircraft going down to Cuba, the Bears, they would drop in alongside them. And it might surprise you to know the crews would wave to one another. You could see them taking photographs of us, and we'd be taking photographs of them. The whole object was to let them know that we knew they were there several hundred miles out.
Organizational changes in 1964 were followed by the cancellation of a number of advanced aircraft projects. The Lightning would have to stay in service for many years as Britain's frontline interceptor. However, by the late 60s, ground-to-air missiles, the latest radar, and the use of supersonic interceptors made high-altitude bombers extremely vulnerable. In response, both the Soviets and NATO developed aircraft which could fly effectively at much lower levels, making them invisible to radar. The newly formed RAF Strike Command now needed a radar that would look down on the enemy. Aging Shackletons were hastily converted to provide an advanced early warning system. They were supplemented by the purchase of McDonnell Douglas Phantoms from America, which were the first fighters flown by the RAF with an ability to look down on low-flying targets.
The Lightning unfortunately could not do that because it had only a pulse radar. And when looking down against churches, hills, valleys, and so forth, On radar, all you could see were the churches, hills and valleys. We needed, therefore, to have a system that could remove the clutter and to differentiate between a moving target and a target that was static. And the Phantom, when it arrived in 1970, had a pulsed Doppler radar that could detect moving targets. And so for the first time, we found ourselves with an aircraft that could look down into clutter, look down into the low-level environment, and actually attack somebody at low level without having to get a visual acquisition.
Although it was 14-year-old technology, the supersonic Phantom had been battle-proven in the Vietnam War and was capable of carrying an impressive array of rockets, bombs, and cannon. Phantom pilots had discovered that the aircraft also had the ability to perform a task which by now should have been obsolete. The Phantom could dogfight, and it needed to. In Vietnam, Russian-built MiGs proved able to turn inside rockets launched at them by the Phantoms and fly back and engage the now defenseless aircraft. Armaments for short-range protection and the pilot skills to maneuver the aircraft were a necessity. Dogfighting was back. The current fighter capabilities of the RAF are in the hands of the Tornado F-3, which entered service in 1987. The Tornado is a multi-role aircraft designed in fighter, bomber, and reconnaissance versions. Whilst it is a capable fighter, it is unlikely to match Russian aircraft such as the Sukhoi 27 and the MiG-29 in close combat. The answer lies in the European fighter aircraft, which due to political and technical delays will not be in service for some years. It is unmistakably a fighter. The need for manned fighters against much of the post-war thinking still remains. But it is only when it has proved itself in air-to-air combat that the RAF will know if it has the Spitfire of the 21st century.
The Handley Page Halifax was one of the great RAF four-engine bombers of the Second World War. Over 80,000 sorties were flown by Halifaxes, dropping 220,000 tons of bombs on Germany. The Halifax was also widely used in other roles, including as a glider tug, transport, and a general reconnaissance aircraft in Coastal Command. The British Aerospace Harrier GR7 is the latest in a series of revolutionary Harrier vertical or short takeoff and landing jet ground attack aircraft, which began with the GR1 in 1969. It is basically the RAF version of the AV-8B, the Harrier developed for the US Marine Corps by McDonnell Douglas. It has uprated avionics and a night capability, allowing the pilot to use night vision goggles. But the heart of the Harrier concept remains the same. As part of the Rapid Reaction Force, it's still a prime ground attack aircraft able to work from rough strips, motorways, and even villages in support of land forces. Working close to the front line, the Harrier has the ability to land, rearm, and refuel quickly, enabling it to carry out as many as 8 sorties per day. The Harrier is now a more formidable force than ever before. Handley Page Harrow first entered service in 1937 as a bomber, designed to make up numbers while the new types, such as the Wellington, were awaited. But central to the Harrow's design was the ability to convert to a transport aircraft when the short-term bomber role had been completed. Harrows served with distinction throughout the Second World War, delivering troops and evacuating casualties, although the top speed of just 197 miles an hour made them very vulnerable if attacked. Only 100 Harrows were built, all during 1937, and the last were withdrawn in May 1945. The North American Harvard was a standard trainer for the RAF from 1938 until 1955. Normally painted yellow and sometimes nicknamed the Yellow Peril, the single-engine Harvard was not an easy aircraft to fly and taught the trainee pilot to concentrate the entire time he was in the air. But the long canopy gave a marvelous field of vision, and its maneuverability made it the perfect aircraft in which to learn aerobatics. The Handley Page Hastings became the RAF's standard long-range transport aircraft in 1948. Entering service during the Berlin airlift, Hastings operated throughout the world, delivering stores and troops, dropping paratroops, and acting as trainers, surveyors, and ambulances until their withdrawal in 1968. The 146 Hastings produced covered more than 150 million miles during their 20 years of service. When the British Aerospace Hawk entered service in 1977, it became the standard jet trainer in the RAF, replacing the Gnat, Jet Provost, and the two-seat Hunter. An all-round high performance makes the Hawk the perfect introduction to jet flying for many of the student pilots who undergo advanced instruction and weapons training at RAF Valley in North Wales. The Hawk is, of course, best known as the aircraft that equips the Red Arrows, probably the best aerobatics display team in the world. They travel to many countries, as well as all over Britain, giving exhilarating performances, promoting both the RAF and British industry. The Lockheed Hercules has provided the RAF with the range, mobility and versatility it needed during the period of British withdrawal from the Empire. Since entering squadron service in 1967, the Hercules has undertaken all manner of roles, from drops of up to 128 fully kitted paratroops to humanitarian relief flights, delivering food and stores to starving populations in Africa and Yugoslavia. The Hercules had already been in service with the US Air Force for 11 years before joining the RAF, and it proved its effectiveness during the Vietnam War, flying high to avoid Viet Cong ground fire and then diving almost vertically to deliver supplies to remote jungle bases. The Hercules has become a vital strategic component of the RAF's Rapid Reaction Force, and its future is secure, with the order for 36 new C-130Js to be delivered before the end of the century. The odd-looking Handley Page Hayford epitomized the problems of the RAF in the early 1930s. Designed in the late 20s, it didn't enter service until 1933, when it was already virtually obsolete. It had a top speed of just 154 miles an hour and a range of less than 1,000 miles. But many of the pilots who would fly the early wartime missions did their first tour on Hayfords. The Hawker Hind was a light day bomber, which varied little from the classic Hawker Hart, which had been the backbone of the RAF's Empire policing force since 1931. But the Hind's role was substantially different from that of the Hart, in that it equipped 45 bomber squadrons during the massive expansion period of the mid-30s and gave many of the bomber crews who went on to fly Blenheims, Wellingtons and Whitleys their first operational experience. The Hind also became a vital component of the RAF's training process, as many of the bombers were converted to dual controls. More than 80 flying training schools taught thousands of aircrew in the years leading up to the Second World War. Over 500 Hinds were built for the RAF between 1935 and 1937, and the last examples were withdrawn from service in 1940. The Lockheed Hudson was a maritime reconnaissance aircraft and bomber which replaced the Avro Anson from 1939. Either by direct purchase or under the Lend-Lease agreement, the RAF received almost 2,000 American-built Hudsons. They filled a yawning gap in coastal command on anti-submarine and reconnaissance sorties in the early years of the war, and were later used in a variety of roles all over the world until 1945. Throughout the war, new Hudson Marks gave improved performance until the final variant, the Mark VI, which had a top speed of 260 miles an hour and a range of over 2,000 miles. The Hawker Hunter was arguably the best-looking jet aircraft ever to serve with the RAF, and was undoubtedly a dream to fly. Between 1954 and 1959, 1,000 Hunters of 5 different marks replaced the Meteors, Sabres and Venoms, both in the UK and in Germany. The Hunter was basically a single-seat interceptor with a top speed of virtually Mach 1 and a service ceiling of more than 50,000 feet. Later on, Hunters were successfully used as ground attack fighters, carrying the 4 30mm Aden cannon standard to all Hunters and a variety of bombs and rockets. So responsive and easy to fly were the Hunters that they were chosen to form the Black Arrows, Treble 1 Squadron's RAF aerobatic team that were the forerunners of the Red Arrows.